Oh, hi there. Welcome. I'm just chopping some ginger for a honey wine that I'm making, also known as mead. This one's going to be a spiced holiday mead. I'm going to call it the Sugar Plum Fairy because it's going to have plums and figs, dates, cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, a little bit of vanilla, some black tea, and just a bit of orange. And this is going to be something that I'm going to put together here, and I wanted to show you how easy it is to make honey wine. Mead is something that's been around for probably thousands of years. Some people say it was one of the first fermented beverages, and it's simply, in my experience, the easiest. It's really actually as easy as you want to make it. It's just a matter of combining water and honey and a little bit of yeast and letting it ferment for a few months and putting it in a bottle and letting that age if you like. Or you can make it more complicated like what we're going to do today, which involves a lot of different ingredients and mixing them all together, and the procedure or process for how you do that can become a little bit more complicated, but you can make really delightful flavors that can be enjoyed for different festivities and things like that. So without further ado, let's just jump in. And I'm going to try to make this a quick video so that you just have a little tutorial and you can explore a lot of the nuances later on. But the first thing I want to do is introduce you to the tools that you'll be needing. It's really not a whole lot of stuff. Simply a pot and a spoon, a stove to cook on, and a fermenting vessel. So this is a 1-gallon jar, and there's an airlock on top that has a little bit of a cork. Little rubber stopper with the airlock. You can get this at any beer or brewing supply store or online. A funnel will come in very handy, trust me. And that's really about it. If you wanted to get into some of the more expert kind of things, or a little bit later on down the road as you develop a racking cane, this is just something that you can use to siphon your beverage with. And this is a hydrometer, which takes alcohol readings. Maybe we'll go into that a little bit toward the end. But this allows you to know how much alcohol that your mead might potentially mix through the fermentation process, right? So a good knife, a cutting board, and your ingredients. So let's look at the ingredients that we have. So what we have here as far as our mead ingredients, as I mentioned, this is going to be a plum mead. Now it happens that plums are out of season this time of year, which we're in the holiday season here in the winter. And so we've got this prunes. I actually think that the prunes are going to provide a much better flavor, as they'll have sort of a almost caramel-like flavor once they go through the fermentation. So I'm just going to chop those in half and put them into this tea. The first process we want to do is we want to make a tea. And so the first thing we're going to do is put the ginger into water and boil that. So that's the next ingredient that we're going to introduce here, and that would be this ginger root. I like to use a root whenever I make mead because it really gives a foundation to the overall flavor or mouth feel of the honey wine, in that it has a lot of strong flavors. And this is a really nice piece of ginger here, and I'm going to chop it up into small pieces. I don't have to get too carried away with it. It just makes it easier to get it into the fermenter when they're small like that. And furthermore, the more it's chopped up, the more surface area there is for the yeast to cultivate on. And that's a nice thing to think about, providing a home for these little yeasties that are going to help us convert this sugar into alcohol. So we want to make a home for the yeast, and there's a lot to say about ginger, but I'm not going to go into that now. But a ginger is a really great ingredient to use in a mead. I almost always use it or some other root that I have an interest in. So the ginger, we're going to boil that down. All of our roots, we always want to boil the root for about 30 to 45 minutes. Some people would say longer, but I think it'll be suffice to boil it for, a good 30 minutes. A nice simmer even. And then once we have that all set up, and we've got our gingers cooked down. We're going to add into it the spices. And so our spices this time around are going to be cinnamon. I've got 3 sticks of cinnamon, nutmeg, which is a really delightful smell, and it's a really nice ingredient in the herb, in the meads. And so this, I just got a whole nutmeg here, and I'm going to just slice off some pieces, and that you got to kind of gauge. It could be a whole nutmeg or it could be half a nutmeg. We just have to see once we get into making the tea. We'll have a better sense. I like to flavor as I go. I'm not really a by the book kind of person. And then I also have here some star anise. This is, wow, what a beautiful flavor. It's some people are going to like this and some people aren't. It's a little bit licoricey, and so we have to be careful how we use this. I think I might use 1 star in the whole brew here. The other thing is this little clove. Can you see that? I've got this tiny little clove here. And people often ask me, Turtle, can you mess up a mead? And the only answer I have is yes. There's one thing you can do to mess up a mead, and that is to use too much clove. So people, be careful with the cloves. It's a really strong thing. I am going to cut this in half and use just a little pinch of this clove in this 1 gallon mead that I'm making. I also have a vanilla bean that a friend of mine brought me back from Dominica. I'm going to chop up 1 whole vanilla bean. And I have 5 or 6 dates here, and I'm going to chop these dates up. Just nothing too crazy. You know, I'm just going to give it a little, maybe just a slice down the middle. Something like that. You know, just to be able to pull the pit out and also, again, make a little bit of surface area, make it so the yeasties can get into those available sugars a lot better. I think that the dates and the prunes are going to bring a really nice flavor to this. I know some of you don't like prunes, but that's different. This is going to be a fermented thing, and like I said, I think there's going to be some caramelized flavors that come out of the dried prune instead of a fresh plum. That's going to be a little different. I'm also going to use half an orange. I'm going to squeeze the juice into it, and I'm also going to chop the peel and apply the peel a little bit to the tea and let that steep in there, and that will give another little, like an orange zest like flavor. I also have here 1 bag of black tea, and I'm going to add this bag of black tea to this mead. Not all meads do I put black tea in, but sometimes I will because I like the tannins that it gets. You know, think of wines that sit on oak. You know, there's this relationship between the wine and the tannins that are in the oak that give it a certain flavor. And so this black tea can bring a certain bitterness to it that can be kind of nice. Think about how beers have a bitter flavor because of the hops, and there's something about those bitters that we sort of like. And so I want to balance a lot of the sweetness that I'm going to have here with my fruits and my honey with a little bit of this black tea. So, honey. This is 1 quart of honey. This is actually 2 different kinds of honey. This is a wildflower honey and a blackberry honey. So I've got 2 different honeys here, and I'm going to use that. I typically say the darker the better when it comes to the meads. Making this honey work for us, a clover honey is just too light in color, you know. And so here's our mountain wildflower honey. It's a nice amber. It's pretty dark, but not as dark as this blackberry honey is. So if you have honey dealers in your area, visit them and get acquainted with them and talk to them about the darkest honeys. They have tulip poplar is a very nice honey to use. Really, any of these stronger sugars. Honey is a complex thing, and one could study for a long time to learn about the complexities of the honeys. But as a rule of thumb, you can use these dark honeys. I'm going to use about a quart and this half-gallon jar. This is spring water from my local spring here. And if you do the math, these 3 quarts plus 1 quart will equal 1 gallon. Now that's a pretty general honey ratio, I tend to go with something more along the lines of 4 to 1. Think about it, it's on your hand. 4 to 1. So 4 waters to 1 honey, and that's when I make a 5-gallon batch. So this is going to be a little bit close to that. It's an approximation, and I won't use all the honey in my quart jar. But we'll talk about that once we get all that going. So speaking of that, let's get all this going. I'm going to chop this ginger up, and I'm going to get it on the stove so that I got it boiling down. Okay. Now while I chop this ginger, I want to get my water going so it's boiling, right? So let's start with 1/3 of our total water. So that's a quart. So I'm going to put this quart into my pot. I've got a pot that holds 3 quarts, right? So that'll help me know just about how much water I'm using. Now I'm going to put this on the stove, and I'm going to get it going. Put the lid on top. And I want that to start boiling. In the meantime, I'm going to chop up this ginger and talk a little bit more about what it's like to make mead. So we're doing a small batch today. Now, in general, I usually make about a 5-gallon batch of mead. Now that takes 1 gallon of honey to 4 gallons of water. Remember, it's on our hand. 4 to 1. So 1 gallon of honey and 4 gallons of water makes a 5-gallon batch of mead. Now, of course, all of our ingredients are going to need to be much more. So I gave you here a 1-gallon recipe, and if you were making a 5-gallon recipe, you would just multiply that by 5. Now, there's a lot of different things you can use to make meads. I've been doing this for 10 or 15 years, and I've explored a lot of different ideas, and I've, at the same time, rarely do I make the same mead twice. I often make 3-gallon meads. You can see up here on the refrigerator, there's 2 different 3-gallon vessels, really dark, nice colors. Those are from the late autumn, and there are some different berry meads. Now, there's a lot that can be said about the process of fermentation, right? And so let's talk about that really quick. Basically, what's happening is we've got a yeast, which is a single-celled fungus, that is working in the brew on the sugars. And so it's taking those sugars and it's breaking them down. And breaking them down into alcohol, right? So, you know, it's not so much a complex concept here, but it's one that's hard to explain, other than to say that the yeast is eating the sugars and pooping it out as an alcohol. Let us chop up our prunes. Again, I said I was just going to cut those in half. Just give them one little cut. And they'll be really nice. Once they get moist in the wines, they'll expand into nice, they'll rehydrate back into their original plum-like self. So we're just going to give them a quick chop. And now I don't want to boil these, so I just want to let them hang out until the ginger has cooked a little bit. And then I'm going to drop them in, and they'll sit through the whole fermentation, as you will see. Okay, well, it's been just about a half an hour, and we've got something nice going on in here with our ginger. It's just simmering. And I want to add in our woodier ingredients here, our spices. And it's kind of my rule of thumb, is that anything that's woody, something like barks or rosemary roots, things like that, I want to get it in there and let it actually just simmer just a little bit. And so what we have here now is I've got I've chopped up about a half of this nutmeg. And I've got that here, and I've got my cinnamon sticks whole. I'm just going to, instead of chopping them up or anything, I'm just going to throw them in there whole. I don't like to use the powdered cinnamon, as it tends to get a little bit gelatinous during the fermentation process, which makes it kind of sticky and weird. And so I'm not going to use a powder. I'm going to use a stick. And I'm going to take this clove, and like I said, I'm just going to use a little tiny bit. I've sliced it right down the middle. And I'm going to take the smaller piece and I'm going to add that into the ferment here, to our decoction. So the star anise, I'm going to crumple up just one star, and I'm going to have that in there. So let's start with that. I'm going to take this star anise, and I'm going to just break it up into our simmering ginger brew. And then I'm going to take the nutmeg, and add our half a nutmeg to our brew. And I'm going to throw in my whole cinnamon sticks. Stir and let all this get kind of mixed in together. And I'm going to keep that on that simmer for just a few minutes. Just want to let that cook just a little bit. I want to unlock the flavors. Now, most of the flavor will seep out during the fermentation phase, and so it's not imperative that it really cooks per se, but we want to give it a few minutes to go through the simmering process. Okay. While we wait, maybe I'll give you a few ideas about other ingredients that I use. There's a lot of really incredible medicinal herbs that can be used. Again, roots, things like burdock or dandelion are traditional. Birch, sarsaparilla, sassafras, those are all roots that have incredible medicinal as well as flavoring possibilities. You can use leafy things, like I said, rosemary is surprisingly good in a wine. Also things like peppermint or damiana or stinging nettle. These are all medicinal as well as culinary and flavorful ingredients that can be added in. Of course, fruits, that would be a whole nother video called How to Make a Melomel. That's the name of a honey and fruit wine. From blueberries to blackberries, raspberries, apples, grapes. All of these fruits can be incorporated with honey as a stronger sweetener to make really lovely honey wines. Also, grains, braggots, are a really delicious honey wine. A braggot is any honey wine that's fortified with grains, so barley or even rye. But we're going to keep things simple. And so we've got these, few 5 or 6 ingredients. And now that we've had just a moment for them to simmer a little bit here, we're going to go ahead and cut to the chase here and add our fruits. So at this point, I'm going to take it off the heat. Let our decoction sit there, and I'm going to add our dates and vanilla bean and prunes that have been all chopped up. And they're going to go into the pot here, and this hot water is going to reconstitute them, as I mentioned earlier, and they're going to swell up into these really beautiful looking sliced fruits. The other thing I'm going to add now is our black tea bag. So I'm just going to put this tea bag in here, just like you would if you were making a cup of tea, and I'm going to let that steep in there. And we're going to talk real quick about using citrus in mead. I have a friend that swears by it. He uses a lemon or an orange in almost every mead that he makes, and he makes really delicious meads. If you look around on the web or in books, there's going to be a lot of information about checking your acidity level, the pH level of your mead before you add the yeast and begin the fermentation. I don't personally do that. I think that it's a great thing to do, and it's probably a pretty good habit, but in the 10 years that I've been brewing, I like to just keep it simple and not get too involved in the chemistry of it. Really, I just throw all my ingredients together and trust that it's going to work out. And so I don't often use citrus, but in this case, for this particular mead, I think it's going to be a really lovely ingredient. So I'm going to squeeze half of this orange into the brew, and then I'm going to add some of the orange peel. And so I've cleaned these oranges up so there's not a lot of the inner pulp. Let's finish that. And I'm just going to add in the peel, the rind of these oranges. So just a little bit goes a long ways, as one could imagine. Again, the orange can just steep in this. At this point in the process, what we have is we have our ginger and our vanilla and our fruits, our cinnamon and our spices all seeping in this pot together. And once those are finished steeping, we're going to add a little bit of cold water just to balance out the temperature. But we're going to let those steep for just a minute. So at this point, what we have here is the mixture of all of our ingredients just in the pot, simmering, steeping that is. Now what we want to do is we want to add another quart of our water. Okay, so I'm going to take this jar and I'm just going to pour in a quart of the water. Now what that'll do is that'll bring that temperature down from being really, really hot from boiling the ginger to a temperature that's a little bit more friendly when it gets mixed with the honey. You see, when we mix the honey in, we don't want it to be so hot that it kills the raw enzymatic qualities and flavors of the honey. Okay, so we added one more quart of our cold water, and that has reduced this temperature down to something like right around, I don't know, my guess would be about 90 degrees. That's great. Okay, so now that everything is steeped nicely, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to transfer our decoction, or in brewing terms, something you might call the wort, into this fermenting vessel. Okay, so here's where our funnel is going to come in, real handy. I'm going to take the tea bag out. I don't want to leave it in the fermenter, you see. It's going to add too much of those tannins and that bitterness. Just a little bit is all we wanted. So we got rid of the tea bag, and now I'm going to take our nice sweet tea and I'm going to pour it into this fermenter. If any of the parts, the fruits and things come out, that's just fine. It'll tend to choke up your funnel a little bit, so you want to be careful to not get too much going on at once. We're actually going to put the ginger and the fruits and things in by hand. What works really nice at this stage is a chopstick to help poke stuff through. Cinnamon sticks, parts of ginger, pieces of orange rind, bits and pieces of dates. All of this stuff is going to go into the fermenter. It's amazing. You'll find that the ginger, if I was to take a bite now, I would say that it's still got a lot of gingerness to it. It's still rather spicy. And I have found through my experiences with fermenting beverages that when you take this out of the primary fermentation, the ginger, after a few weeks, has lost almost all of its flavor. Often there's nothing left, it just tastes like pulp. So that gives me a lot of courage to put it in there because I just know that all that flavor that's locked up in that ginger still is going to travel out into the brew. So let me just get all this squared away here. Art is messy, as they say, and it's good to have a towel on hand to clean up, especially when it comes to pouring the honey. It's hard not to make a mess a lot of times. All right. Well, now that we've got that in there, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put this airlock on top of there just to keep any kind of stuff from coming in. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the remaining amount of our water and I'm going to pour that in there. I'm going to save a little back just so that we can top things off at the end. We don't want to have too much liquid going into the fermenter. If I had used all of the amount of water and I added the honey, it might be too much, in which case it won't fit all into the fermenter and we would have to lose some of what we've got. Now what we want to do is we want to bring this water back up to temperature. Just warm enough that it'll melt the honey. That's our main goal here. As I said a minute ago, we don't want to heat the honey up too much because that will kill those lovely enzymes that the bees worked so hard to make for us. So with just a little bit of water in here, it shouldn't take too long for this water to warm up to enough to melt this honey down. Now if you'll follow with me, this is the important part. This is the part that everybody wants to know, which is what is the ratio of water to honey? And as I said earlier, it's on our hands. It's 4 to 1. 4 waters to 1 honey, or something there about that. So with the 1 gallons, I have found that what works is to take my quart jar of honey, it's almost all the way full, and I'm just going to flip it upside down and drain this into the water. And just about the time that it comes to where it's taking too long for it to come out, after most of it's poured out and it's just drizzling just a little bit, I flip that over and I'll observe that about an inch or less of honey will remain in the jar. And to me, that's kind of the perfect ratio. I don't want to use a full quart, in other words. So the way I've come to find what works for me is to just pour it until it doesn't come out so easily. So let's go ahead and do that. It's really beautiful stuff. We love honey here, and we're really excited about this nice mix of wildflower and blackberry that we've got. So if you can pay close attention, you'll see that it's still running pretty good for me. And I want to pay attention to that point in which it's just a slow drizzle. Okay, I'm going to call that done. I'm going to set that back down, and hopefully we'll see that there's just a small amount remaining. The water's warm now, and so with my spoon, I'm going to give this a nice little stir to fully melt the honey down. When I brew on a larger scale with large pots, I like to really get into the stirring. There's something about introducing oxygen into the brew that really helps the yeast go through their fermentation. And so it's really important to kind of get a nice vigorous stirring going. I particularly like stirring first one way and then the other way. That seems to create almost kind of a rhythmic meditation. Okay, so now that we've got our honey pretty well melted down into here, looks like it's become one with the water. I'm going to introduce it into the fermenter. Observe this nice, rich color. Okay, so we see now we've introduced the honey and the water with our tea, and we've got quite a bit of room left to finish topping off. So we're going to go ahead and add this last little bit of water, and it looks like we could use a little bit more. Just going to take some of this well water I have here, and I'm going to warm this up. One of the things I really want to get clear to you folks back home is how important it is to start off with a nice warm fermenting. The yeasts, they like to start at somewhere between 90 and 100 degrees. So we don't want to lose too much heat in our beginning. Our tea was hot, our honey water was warm, and if we add a lot of cold water to it, that's just going to cool it down probably too much. So we're going to warm this water up that we're going to add into that. In the meantime, let's have a conversation about yeasts. So there's two schools of thought. There's one school that works with what's called wild fermentation, and there's some lovely books out there, Wild Fermentation and also The Art of Fermentation by Sandor Katz. And these are great books that cover that in detail, that process, and it's really much simpler in some ways in that it just involves collecting the yeasts that are just in the atmosphere of your own home or your own environment. And so that involves putting this must, which the combination of our tea and our honey is called, into a pot and covering it with a cheesecloth and giving it a stir for once a day, twice a day, for 3 days, and then putting it in the fermenter with the airlock. And that stirring allows the wild yeast that's in the air to come in. However, I'm today going to use a packaged yeast, and this will be my one plug to a label here, which is Lalvin. And this is the D47 yeast. This is a yeast that I've come to really like, and it's really a nice I think it's a pseudo champagne yeast. I find that the champagne, Red Star champagne yeast to be a little too strong for what I want to do with the mead making. The D47 really allows the flavors of the honeys and so forth to stay intact in the final flavor. There's a lot of yeasts out there that you can find on the shelf, and you can experiment with all those different kinds of yeasts. The one thing that I'll say about yeast, and this is maybe a little complicated, which is that, you know, there's an idea if you just keep adding honey to it, that should make a sweeter mead, right? Well, that's not always the case. A lot of how you get a dry or a sweet mead has to do with which type of yeast you use. Yeast will ferment out to a very specific alcohol content, and that's how you control how much sweetness that you have. If you have a lot of honey and a very strong yeast, you'll end up with a very dry, highly alcohol content mead. Whereas if you have just a little bit of not very much honey, that won't necessarily yield a dry mead. You want to use a yeast that will ferment out to about 13% and then use more or less honey depending on whether you would like a dry or a sweet mead. It's a little bit more complicated. There's books and things on the web that might explain that a little bit better than I did, but hopefully that gives you a sense of the spectrum of flavors that are available and how yeasts can affect that and give you optimal results. Okay, so now that our topping water is a little bit warmer, I'm going to go ahead and add that. Okay, that's pretty good. Now we don't want to fill it up too full, because what will happen is if this thing starts to really get vigorously fermenting, it'll actually push a lot of the ingredients up into the airlock, and that can cause a sort of mead bomb in your kitchen. So I'm going to give it a little shake to make sure there's enough sweetness on top. We just added all that fresh water, and sometimes the yeast can't find their way through the fresh water. And so we want there to be a nice, sweet place for the yeast to wake up. Let's take a look at our jar. You can see that there's a good bit remaining. That's about perfect, I would think. Now here's where we would take the hydrometer testing, and we take a reading from this hydrometer, and that would tell us, by pouring this liquid into this tube, by pouring the mead into the tube, we can float the hydrometer, and that'll give us an idea of what the final outcome is going to be. But for sake of shortness, I'm going to skip that process tonight, and I'm going to just add our yeast. Now this packet will do 5 gallons of mead. Now we only have 1 gallon here, so I'm going to use about 1/3 of the packet just to be conservative. And if you use the whole packet, it's not going to make anything better or worse. Okay? Now some people like to make a yeast starter. That's not a bad idea, especially here in the wintertime. You take the yeast and you add it to a little mixture of sugar and water, or honey and warm water, and you get that started in the morning. Let it go for a couple hours, and that'll get the yeasts to be vigorous and ready. Personally, I think there's something nice about just letting them slowly acclimate to their new environment. It's kind of like, for those of you that are gardeners, you know, transplanting or something like that. This is a little more like direct sowing, and the yeasts are going to wake up in their new home, this garden of delight, and they're going to enjoy their stay here. So let's talk briefly about the airlock. The airlock is just a little device that has some water in it. So as the mead ferments, it's going to be off-gassing some CO2, and that will escape through the airlock, and meanwhile the water will actually protect anything from outside coming in. So it's a really ingenious little design here, and that will allow this to be hermetically sealed. Now, one last thing is to keep it warm. And to keep it warm, I like to take a sweater or something that I've gotten from Goodwill or what have you, and just dress it up nice. You can even cover the bottom of it. Typically I would wipe the vessel down, but for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to wrap this up real quick. This is going to keep our mead warm while it's fermenting over the next couple months. It's going to create its own heat inside, but it's also trapping in this initial warmth that we have. And so that's a really ideal environment for the yeast to ferment in. Also, it keeps the light out, which I think in the long run will really make the yeasts a lot happier. So that in a nutshell is how to make a mead. I hope that you got a lot out of this and learned a thing or two. Please feel free to comment in the comment section of the video, and perhaps myself or other mead makers or viewers will answer questions that you might have, or we can begin a dialogue around this. This video is meant to be a pilot for a series of informational videos on gardening and fermentation, mead making, medicines, herbs, survival skills, first aid. All kinds of things are going to fall under a heading of a series of videos made by myself and others, informing folks about various self-sufficiency skills. So, if you like the video, please let us know. And if you have any requests as to other kind of videos that we can be working on, do fill that into the comment box or contact us at mathemagicalschool@gmail.com. Thanks so much for your attention.